So role-playing occupies quite a large space in the Faustian, you could say, hobby realm, or as a byproduct of the imaginative properties, creative properties of particularly young Faustian men. This is probably most interesting to us because of the way that it connects, I would say, a spiritual longing for certain things with a real and becoming and tangible and palpable essence. So we can say the role-playing game satisfies some of these yearnings that we have, whereas previously, historically, we have probably just done those things. So for rightly or wrongly, we've tried to fill this vacuum with the artificial. So we've replaced the real, and the real has been absent not due to volition necessarily, but more of a supervening circumstances. Because of the nature of reality, modern society, you call it, it means per force we are dealing with less interactivity on the unknown, and particularly around certain archetypal needs and behaviors. So this is where the RPG fills that blank. It becomes a canvas for us to explore intellectually, sometimes even physically, in the ways that we allow ourselves to become certain ideals we may have or archetypes we live into. Now, the RPG, the role-playing game, is something very uniquely Faustian and born probably a lot out of, you could say, the fantasy world, but also then in relation to, in particular, war games and how wargaming has stemmed from something a Prussian officer in general would do, Helmut von Moltke, etc., all the way through to modern discourse, which was related directly to the formalized and very prescriptive versions of rule sets, which take into account certain dynamics. And I'll walk you through a little bit of that. But the important part, I think, the primary function of good versus bad, productive versus negative or wasted time, or how we can think about it in a balanced sense. In general, I obviously advocate that you spend as much time in real life doing real life things for real life reasons, because it just is more purposeful for your life and your career ambitions. In general, it generates this feeling of success to you that you can achieve substantial goals in how you're interfacing with reality versus in your hyper reality or in your creative imaginative spaces online in games, things like this, which become non-real accomplishments, but they give you the dopamine and the feelings of, say, actual accomplishment, which we want to avoid. So what we're going to do is harness the creativity, the imagination, and I say the learnings you can experience vicariously. Then we transmute them and transmit them into our own lives, and then thus we enhance our own version of reality. So you can lean into creative imagination spaces to develop your own reality and your abilities, you can say. If I use my creative thinking, if I use my imagination, all these figments I've been able to conjure can start to become helpful tools for me to realize analogously or metaphorically certain parts and particulars of my own life. Once again, this is what RPGs are very, very good at. We don't want to get lost into this nerdish tunnel and warren where we've delved so deeply we can't extract and extirpate ourselves out of this. Much more we want to engender the balance, and this is how I'll talk into this. Lastly, I think that the important notion of this is the verisimilitude. What is the realistic? Realism in RPG is obviously a fairly lent term. It has a lot of angles around what it means. So particularly because the way that we think of realism is a transmogrified term of feeling. It goes from being in reality realism of dealing with situations pragmatically in a way that's taking all of the presuppositions and the precepts and entwining them into how we can actually impact them and do things with them, to into the, if we take that scenario, that interaction, the interactivity into a imaginary realm, can we still perform the same processes? So what we're looking at is keeping the rationale, the logic, the logos of that consistent into a generated and artificial world. And this is where the imagination comes into play. If I introduce elements which are not natural, as in mystical, ethereal, etheric, magical, whatever have you, then it becomes something where you have to understand there's a probability element or a realistic element associated to those notions, the phenomena. if I have magic, what does that mean in terms of the reality of the system that it's influencing? This is where it becomes difficult. This is where the notions and the ideas and the generative sentences around what makes a good and bad RPG start to become realized in that sense. How do I play? How do I ingratiate myself? How do I become the mage, the summoner, whatever, sorcerer, with the realistic attempt to portray myself as this as it would be if I was actually that person? This sort of transposition, this empathy, this vicarious living is very, very useful for many, many things in your life, because it allows for a tool set, an instrumentation of how I can become something else, think like someone else, and also understand someone else. And the better you are at this, the better you are in real life. Yeah, almost all interactions require for you to transpose yourself upon the other person and their view set and their mindset, and understand empathetically, sympathetically how exactly you deal with their situation in their own consciousness, how they would react, how their rationale works. Anything from dating all the way through to friendships to business, all of this requires these elements, these traits. And there are a few things that are good at building these things than RPGs. And this once again goes back to why I have war games, why I have tabletop representations, replications of a function like war. Well, because there are certain learnings that can be done without the need for the battle, for the war. So we can be prepared, and more preparedness is usually better than not. And in doing so, we become, I would say, a more advanced version in skills and in demeanor and in dispositions and things like that. So we're inclined to take these steps towards this to achieve these outcomes. Now, the good RPGs allow for the development of, I would say, the world or the setting as the primary force of belonging and being. How do I generate what is a reality people want to participate in? Most RPGs, therefore, rely heavily on the real world. You can have many, many, many versions of low fantasy or fantastical elements introduced into our own reality. You don't even need magic. It just could be some business RPG where you go and be a businessman. You've seen these in games in particular, like online and video games, where you have something like Roller Coaster Tycoon or any number of even something like Grand Theft Auto, which you could consider a role-playing game because you're playing a role. This is one of those times or occasions when you would live out, say, darker fantasies around doing things like that. But I think in general, that's the way we start to think about these things, is that you have a certain circumspection on the realm and the ability to play within this system and schema. Now, the good worlds rely quite heavily on, like I said, either reality or, if they're fantasy, then on our very fixed notion of something similar to mythological fantasy worlds, particularly the Norse and Germanic pagan mythologies of realms and gods. And you can think of this heavily reliant on someone like Tolkien, who has brought to life what is this blended, melded fantasy of what the historical functions of societies and cultures clashing looks like. So his was heavily based on, say, like Byzantium and Saxon England and things like this, and then transposed upon that are certain elements like hobbits and elves, and they represent other things symbolically and also crypto-metaphysically, how he thought about his own notions of morality and anomic certain requirements. Do we think that the fallen angels are bad and devils, and there's all these notions around, for him, Catholicism, but in general the elements appropriated from what was Germanic paganism, so the gods and the dwarves and the interactivity between a powerful ring and things like this. You can pick these notions up, particularly if you studied what he studied, was things like Beowulf and the Ring Saga Sigurd, particularly Götterdämmerung, things like this. Now, the world we create is important because, like I said, it grounds us in this. We have to know about the world as much as is possible to intrigue us and to relate ourselves into it. This is why these two worlds are the most important. So something like the real world with a low fantasy elements, something like Harry Potter, makes sense. It's very relatable, and there's a small shift gap to jump into the magical or the fantastical element. On the other hand, it would be, as I said, Tolkien's Middle-earth or something like the Warhammer Fantasy world, where we understand the geospatial actualities of it. It looks like Earth to some degree. It looks like places we could have been and seen. And we understand it still notionally as a planet with gravity, with fauna, flora, all of these naturalistic elements, there's nothing to it that's so beyond our comprehension that we couldn't fathom it. So that is a super important part of this verisimilitude. How do we keep the setting and the world relatable, grounded, but also fantastical enough for us to bother being intrigued? Because it has to be, once again, divergent enough from our existing coexistence in this real plane that we want to actually bother learning about it and spending our time on it. Otherwise, you play a historical RPG where you're anyone from any time and place that's actually occurred, and there are different rules for that, and it's also a very good way of doing it. You can go to Napoleonic France, you could go to the American Civil War, you could just do a normal time of Victorian England, you could solve crimes, you can have drama, you could have anything from being a lady's maid to being Jack the Ripper. You can see how there's all these notions around creating certain and scenarios and environments which you can just interact with. Then the rules are provided. So the rules are very, very important. This is because we obey by existing rules here on planet Earth. We have social rules like laws, but we also have physical rules like gravity. And so there are restrictions on what we can and cannot do. Knowing these and setting these out, we intuit some of these, but we also get told and are formed these things in school and whenever in our real lives. So it's also nice to be indoctrinated into those rules in this new world. What is it that I can and cannot do? It's very important. You'll find rule books for RPGs being very thick and long. Video games have fixed ideas of what you're allowed and not allowed to do. Video game RPGs have those elements pre-programmed. So you can start to understand why rules are important. Rules have to follow the logic. The logic is allowing us to behave in a certain way that's predictable. The predictability goes into this verisimilitude, how we believe the probability and the actions that we are taking are possible. And we relate that to that. So this is that dynamics, this system, this setting. The setting is derivative. So the rules should be coexistent, concomitant to the setting. And the setting is therefore allowing us to insert ourselves. And this becomes how we relate ourselves in this world, particularly through a character. So you take charge of, and you can see here, a character sheet, usually. And it can be anything, like I said, low fantasy, high fantasy. It's just a way to represent yourself. And the way you would do that best is to choose a character you feel as if you can empathize with enough to become, in a little portion of your brain, that person, that thing, that element, that character. So either a male dwarf or a female elf or a orc with no gender, whatever it is, you have to become that character in a way that the RPG should reward you for behaving in that way, because it's predictive and it's telling that you're able to understand how that character's interaction with the grander world and other characters and would and should relate. This becomes an issue with modern games because we inject our own identity and then therefore thus the derivative of that, politics, into these games. So the reason D&D is dog shit at the moment, and the reason all of these other games, is because you have these very incessantly political people, and incessant in the knowing way of not necessarily having stolid belief system around values. It's what's progressive, and progressives in general ruin almost all forms of imaginative creations. They go into any world, even up to sports. This is why you have trannies in sports, and you have all this push towards diversity and inclusion and all these nice sounding terms, which is just a very polite and pejorative way of saying we're going to despoliate and ruin what are nice created spaces, and in particular ones that are, I think, designed by guys who just wanted something to do, be corrupted. And then there's always the contention, well, if you don't like it, don't play it, if you do this. But at some point it becomes very both ignominious to ignore these things and just say, like, I'll just move on, I'll just do something else, even though they ruin something I hold sacred. But it also behooves us, I think, to just say no to these things, because sometimes things as they are fixed are better. So someone taking Tolkien's works and starting to make more Middle-earth fantasy because they like it, and saying that there's 2 lesbian elves and there's 2 tranny orcs, this clearly is just an injection of modern society's views on certain moral topics, rightly or wrongly, injected into what is a fixed historical setting, just so that we can have what we determine is inclusion in this day and age. You can see the shift here is always going to be, rather than being timeless, it's very, very sempiternal, which engenders in us a feeling of this disbelief. And this is how this verisimilitude drops. We think the probability an orc and a human get along is very low, and particularly because you have a clashing characteristics. One is a very pugnacious and irascible, almost very inhuman, but illogical being who's concerned maybe with more of brutality and wars. The other one's us, a human. And you would say that these two things are not compatible. There's no reconciliation of these two modus operandi in how they live, eat, feel, and believe. So how would these two be friends? Well, in D&D they go, yeah, but it's deep in the skin color. It's orcs are actually misunderstood, blah, blah, blah. And they're trying to ingratiate them in ways which is just diluting the importance, the meaning, and the symbology of them, whilst also just watering down and ruining the probability or like the feeling of possibility and as I say, verisimilitude. So this is how we can understand the modern context of why some games are being ruined is very clearly by people, and people ruin them because they feel as if they can be more inclusive. They either sell more, and once you introduce economics to systems, you ruin them almost as a rule. More profit means bigger market share, means more inclusion to people who you think. And then also the people that are employed to create these things very much balance themselves in this liminal space between being a masculine man who likes Conan the Barbarian and heroics, and a progressive politics, let's all be equal and have fun and be nice to each other and give participation trophies. So you can see how there's very difficult valence here between these two ideologies when it comes to creating something that makes sure that these things are inseparable. And so Conan would obviously hate homosexuals. And so it's not saying that's on Conan. That's how Conan would think, just because of the nature of Conan is that he's in barbaric savage wastelands, and that's how he would treat people who are different in general. But specifically, so if you're trying to write these rules, you write them in a way that reflects Conan. You don't go, oh, now I want Conan to be actually very progressive, and he's going to have pink hair, and he's going to make sure that he's very inclusive to everyone. And I mean, just you can see how this lowers the verisimilitude. Once again, it goes into these archetypes, the relatability, and how much of the abstraction you can make away from I want the character to be like this to the character would just be like this. The ethical concerns I have, so how axiologically I am comparing these things, is just a unnecessary function. It's don't do it because you'll just ruin the feeling and the flavor of the game. I wouldn't want to play a game unless I was interested in how the setting was able to interact without my prefixed ideas on morality. I would like to go into a setting and see what the morality they have is, and then out of that conjure my own. This, I think, is the important part of the believability. This creates narrative possibilities, and narrative is very, very important in RPG. Our lives are narratives. At least Faustian Gothic men have a destiny and a fate. This is directly tied to what we call a narrative. Beowulf, his saga, things like this are all narratives. It's not that they're not lived, it's that we describe them in ways that we evoke and imbue it with feeling more than we just recount things. It's not enough that Pizarro was lost in Aztec Maya, South America. It's that the feeling of him being so far away from home with his small troop on a ship and then encountering foreign elements who are trying to kill him, and he conquers them and establishes the kingdom of Peru, is much more heroic and grand to us because of the narrative it conjures in our minds. And this is how we can start to think about those things, is that the narrative is just a reflection of a creative spirit we try to employ on a story, on a lived experience. And this is the same element that we try to utilize in an RPG. An RPG would also be this role-playing of a character who goes through a journey. We call it a hero's journey sometimes, but there's a lot of notions around how you, when you're young, go through different stages of growth and Bildungsroman and all this sort of other ideas around growing into who we are and becoming better people, better in any way, shape or form that we can define it. But that's how the possibilities start to flourish and burgeoning. Now, the way that we do this is by offering choices and consequences. And this goes into the system to a degree. I need rules that are based on these things. So I try to create a playing field where choices are mandatory and they have impact. RPGs with no choices are obviously boring. You don't do anything, but ones with choices with no impact are also boring because nothing really matters. And that's a terrible way to construct a system because it's just not, for us, it doesn't embroil us into anything, which means that there's no feelings of risk, and if we feel as if nothing would happen and nothing bad could happen, then there's no need for anything good to happen, because anything and always is all good. You've seen children play games, they always want to win, they don't want to lose, and because the feeling of winning becomes monotonous after a while, they don't want to play the game anymore. But losing a game and then starting to win and then losing again and winning again is what keeps us interested, because the development there is obviously something that's much more of a challenge, and there's choices and the consequences for the winning and the losing. Thus engenders in us that feeling of it's better to have a game that reflects, once again, reality, and how believable that is. What the verisimilitude is related to that. These are hopefully living worlds, and living not in obviously the real sense, but the abstract. We want a world that feels as if it's something where I can participate, and there's consequences, there's reactions, catalysts, there's a substrate, there's all of these chemical elements and properties which go into creating phenomena and experiences, and out of that a narrative can form, and the characters involved can vary. They can be PCs, playable characters, or they can be NPCs, and this is where you do get this idea of different positions, like a game master, a dungeon master, and how they go about creating and curating a space and a journey and a direction. Some have prescribed campaigns, for instance, and they have acts, chapters in the campaigns where you're trying to achieve objectives, and they either railroad you into a certain outcome that you have to do. Like if I'm in a doomsday scenario, I have to stop the doomsday, or I don't. This is kind of railroaded into a decision where there's a denouement. Do I finalize this mission by saving the world or not? But then there's also lived a sandbox style RPG where you make your own story, and I just interact into that. It can be like your life. No one's purposefully told you to pick a partner, make a family, take a job, travel here, explore there. This is not something that anyone forces upon you. So a sandbox idea is a reflection of that reality. So there's two believable scenarios here. One is you're enjoined into what is an existing narrative, someone else's story, and now you're participating, you're an element to it, and you can probably gauge your gravitas, or like the level of your impact to that. So am I a very impactful person and character? And if you look at historical events, you'll see main characters basically, and then secondary and tertiary characters who influence small minor parts. And this is just true also for these. This is how you relate your own life. Then you think, I'm the main character, there are secondary characters in my life, and narratively they employ and are employed by me into certain ways to do certain things, and we react and show that way. But then you're also vice versa, secondary, tertiary characters in other people's lives. Go to work, your own colleagues and things like this, whether your employer, your CEO. So someone like, say, Donald Trump or Elon Musk, or large central figures would probably be the apex here of this character feeling, where everyone's playing into your game. Super nice feeling, makes you an egomaniac probably to a large degree, but it's also how we can think about the lack or the need, not as much need for an RPG, or for someone like that with that much power and experience and responsibilities. An RPG becomes as a very much a secondary hobby. I think actually Elon is probably utilizing and employing RPGs, and I doubt Donald Trump is pretending to be anyone else. But in general, we can still think of that as a hobby which could give an employee certain benefits. So if I took Trump through a 2-hour role-playing session on, say, some fantasy world, it was Harry Potter or Warhammer or something, he would still, I think, get a lot out of that. He wouldn't do it for various reasons, but I do think it would not be a waste of time for him as a person to grow in some ways. Because we can make it interactive, we can base it on probabilities and skills, set up scenarios. You can still relate all these things back to how you would make the scenarios, but it's also nice to know that your character, if I'm a meek, callow halfling, that I would probably not be as assertive and not be as aggressive, and I would have to think about things differently because I couldn't impose myself physically into, say, a fight or into a scenario, into a battle, into a war. I had to be more surreptitious and considerate and circumspect around these things. So this is how I would start to think about the idea of how RPGs can help you. It's not enough to turn on a video game and just click, 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 smash, smash, smash. Any monkey can do this. What we're talking about really is understanding narratives and creating scenarios which are relating you to something else, in which it may be a learning to you, and maybe a situation you then foresee or happen across in your life, and you can then obviously make that decision that way. This goes into maybe the last point I have, second to last point, penultimate, maybe anti-penultimate, is that you have characters and the archetypes, as I said, that are along what we might call standard ethical lines, and that we have this concept of gathic-ecological, which is the good and the bad. Now, in our reality, I think, or at least after Nietzsche, it's become such that we are beyond a good and evil. It's nonsensical as a term now. There's no need for it. It doesn't do anything. But I think in role-playing games, there's still an element to where you hear used defined as lawful, neutral, and chaotic, which is quite a good way of maybe thinking and propositioning the moral space, or at least the behavioral mapping of someone. Because in identities, we all have certain elements of law-abiding or chaotic or ambivalence, neutrality. So knowing that, and then cross combination with a certain archetype. So I feel as if I'm, say, like a hero archetype, or I'm a mage or a sage archetype, then I would want to know what that means from a role perspective. How do I role play as it? It's just easier if you get given guidelines. And here there's just 12 elements where you have, if you're a magician, well, a magic and arcane is your school or your grand archetype, then you could be a sorcerer if you're chaotic, or a summoner if you're neutral, and then a wizard if you're lawful. Role playing into these things just makes small and minor decisions easily traversable and understandable as to what your character would do. If it's a scenario where I'm trying to save the princess as a wizard, I would try and help, probably, if that princess was for the kingdom that I was fighting for or whatnot. As a sorcerer, maybe I've entrapped the princess there with my own magics, and then therefore the opposite would be true. I would, or it could be chaotic, pure chaos, where maybe I help, maybe I don't, depending on what's in it for me, or how I find it to be most entertaining, or whatever, if you're a Loki type chaos figure. This is why the interest can be both a personal construction, but also given, and this is deigned by the system and the world. And this goes into, once again, martial. And so martial characters who maybe have a religious element, could be monks or paladins, and otherwise it can be barbarians or fighters or soldiers or rogues here, which are probably quite a lot more singular individual versus, say, a captain or a general who's obviously much more banded to his brothers. If you think of like chapter masters or knightly orders, things like this. And then obviously you have divinity and how gods might interplay. We have our own gods in our world, so obviously gods can be infected into other systems. How do we employ those? What does that mean? So those archetypes, I think, are very, very important. So the penultimate point here was going to be on maps and the relationship we have to geospatial awareness. This is maybe very masculine energy, and we think of the relationship we have to the world as one of geospatial awareness. Women maybe less so, or at least feminine inclined people are less so disposed to thinking like that, and there's a certain countenance for a environment which is mapped. We like it. It's agreed upon. It's something that we would consider good. And so I choose, and probably many like me choose, to play games where maps are instilled as basic one of the primary functions, or like necessary functions and descriptions. You need a map to know where you are, how to get to places, how it relates to certain cities to other certain cities. If there's any politics involved, what does that mean? Because a lot of Schmidt covers this, nomos, and the way we define the property laws in the world are drawn out of land, and land is very important for those reasons. That's inextricable from our own identity and our belonging and property ownership, things like this, law, and these are all very essential elements to any system which has got to function in a low or even high fantasy world. Kingdoms, empires, dukedoms all seek to dominate, and this domination and power element comes disposed upon us, and particularly divine down onto land and fortresses and castles, etc. So you can see how maps and the particularly towns within maps and houses and who lives where becomes very essential elements, much easier to draw them, have them given, because it's, once again, verisimilitude is higher. If I know that there's a city, then I know that there's a million houses. I should be able to visit every house like I can in my own city. Would I visit every house and knock on every door? I would, of course, not do that. But in a world where I can do that, obviously I can go door to door knocking and offering and talking to anyone for any reason. So the ability to do that is still there. And I think the consequences should be rational to the system, to the characters, to the world environment. Historically, probably we had better communities and where people knew each other, so it's much easier to relate back. Historically, if you have a fantasy world which is nominally set in a historical century, so like the 15th century, then that would be that. And so that's how we get to that. And lastly, I think it goes into the progress, growth, and achievement. The essential elements to RPGs are getting better, getting stronger, getting further along on your journey. And at the end, it is just so important to understand that your life is like this. So when you do play these games, try to take away from a session, from a campaign, from a discourse on these topics is something that you can relate to your own life. Think about it in a role-playing game scenario, and you might actually start to understand yourself just that little bit better.